I like telling the story of Justin Brown from Farm Credit East, who 6 years ago looked at a business plan that I gave him and came to the conclusion that I knew a hell of a lot about numbers, but I didn't know a damn thing about farming. However, I think it's important to acknowledge that I know nothing about farming. If we are going to be really decent social entrepreneurs, that's a kind of admission that I think is very, very helpful. It is one thing to recognize that there's a problem that moves you very, very deeply, and that you should be able to also admit that despite how deeply you may feel about it, that you're not ready or do not know enough about how to solve that problem. And I think when we started Corbin Hill Farm and we had a big problem on our hands in terms of food within our community, I was really one who knew nothing about farming, moved deeply by a problem, but quite frankly, was not sure how to deal with it. And so that what you will hear this evening is really the process over the last 5 years of how we evolved to getting this. There are three things we want to look at this evening, and one is to really re-examine what we've learned. I think knowledge is something that we just make a lot of assumptions about knowledge that it's the truth, and it's not necessarily so. We also want to touch on the themes of ethics and values, because this, quite frankly, is particularly important in terms of how we link it to knowledge. And the third piece I think is really important in understanding Corbin Hill is really whose political interest am I serving? While I know very little about farming, I am the founder and the president of Corbin Hill Food Project. And yes, we do own 95 acres in Schoharie County, and to no one's surprise, we do not grow much there. It is consistent with our limited knowledge, quite frankly. What I think is important, however, is not what we do not grow, but really because that really does not have any impact on Corbin Hill's mission. Our mission is straightforward, and that is that we essentially want to get fresh produce to those who need it most. Now, we do this through a hub by aggregating with farmers upstate and distributing to 4 boroughs in the city of New York, to what my friend Karen Washington, who just received a James Beard Award last week, describes as food swamps suffering from food apartheid. Many of the ideas that frame what we talk about goes back 10 years ago to my colleague Nidhi Srivinas at the New School, in which we jointly taught a class. He is absolutely the theoretician of all theoreticians, and I am actually the practitioner of all practitioners. And so this was the yin and yang going on between the two of us, in which we would consistently argue about does theory drive practice, or does practice drive theory? And quite frankly, there are a couple of things we do agree on. Of course, we've never resolved that issue between us. But the most important thing that I think is important is the fact that we both agree that whether it's theory or practice, it's driven by ideology. And it's something that we normally don't want to admit. And as a practitioner, to me, the most important thing also about being a practitioner is the fact that one has to be extremely intentional. It is not good enough to have the ideology if you're not being intentional. Let me give you a quick example. This past summer, 80% of all of our community organizers and our community cooks were bilingual. I look around to all the others who were working in these communities who claimed that, yes, this is a great idea, but we can't find anybody who looks like you. I think they were just not intentional about what it is they wanted to do. Let me go to the area of particularly knowledge. Let's see if I get this right. Okay. I want to put these words up as background to thinking about what I'm going to say about in terms of knowledge, values, and politics. We tend to deal with knowledge as a given that goes unquestioned. My colleague Nidhi constantly pointed out to me that we associate names with presumption as to what they mean and never really examining what they do not mean. And I think as you look at these words, I think everyone in this room can tell us what certain words here mean, but they have really not thought about what it does not mean. And in the process of not talking about what it does not mean, they never pause to consider the values that these words may reflect and the politics they serve. All right. It's ironic because I think as social entrepreneurs, the biggest barrier to us being very creative is not to discuss what knowledge is about, what we know, and what we do not know. Yet our principles, our values, our ethics are all shaped by these assumed knowledge. And if we wish to question the knowledge, we must also question the set of values that go along with it. We become prisoners, actually, in a real sense, between the knowledge we have, the values we have, the ethics we work with. And we don't realize ourselves as prisoners in terms of how we talk about these implicit values that underlie the knowledge that we kind of say is the truth. Before further talking about Corbin Hill, let me just kind of quickly mention the issue of power. Power for us at Corbin Hill is a very simple question. Whose political interest are we serving? We do not, hesitate about that. Are we talking about the farm worker? Are we talking about the farmer? Are we talking about the investors? Or are we talking about our own community? And that to us is really a very important set of questions. It's ironic. All of us would like to think of ourselves as being able to develop a value-based chain in which everyone is at the table, and whether it be the farm worker or the community. The reality is you almost cannot never hear a voice even talking about the farmer. In our community, it's very different. Everyone wants to talk about us and give us advice. They want to tell us, but fundamentally, when it comes to food policy, the reallocation of resources, what's best for us, everyone has an answer for our community. As a matter of fact, if I may say so, there are many people who are so intense about their sense of what we need as a community that they think that their voice is ours. But that goes back to the whole question about knowledge and values. They're assuming that we are working with the same set of knowledge base that they're working with, and that we share the same values they do. And that's a heck of an assumption to make. It is critical that an entity like Corbin Hill actually articulate and communicate its values. This is not difficult for us because of how we were founded. $750,000 was put up by 11 people. 71% of it came from Blacks and Latinas. I didn't say Latinos, Latinas, and 51% from women. We had no question whatsoever in our mind who politically we were going to be working for. We're not unique in trying to define, because of that we were able to talk about our vision and our values, but we're not unique in terms of defining our values. There are other organizations that have done this. I love to talk about Veritable Vegetables, a $42 million organic distributor of organic food on the West Coast that's all owned by women. The entire management, really, all women. But what is fascinating has to do with their values. Within their organization, they have an explicit ratio as to what senior executives can make relative to the lowest paid worker in the company. I really don't know how many of us who sit around and talk about social justice and equity can say that our organization has such an explicit set of values, or that, quite frankly, we lead an organization that has no set of values. What it meant for us is that we had some space in which we could actually think. We could think about words like transforming things, and in a very transformative way. What we wanted to do was create our own conversation within our community around food. This is a conversation that, if you listen to it on the outside, tends to be very negative. We make bad decisions, we do this, we do that, et cetera, we're obese. Nobody puts it in the context of what it is going on. However, if you're going to start a new conversation and you're really re-examining the knowledge that's there, one of the things that you find yourself doing is essentially having to create a new vocabulary. Because the vocabulary that existed for us in terms of talking about our community was essentially made no sense to us. And the terms in which we created this new vocabulary was rather straightforward, simple. We started off, first of all, by talking about a shareholder. Well, and by the way, editors who have been writing about us have a very difficult time understanding why a shareholder is always a capital S. Okay? So that we're talking about shareholders, and quite frankly, you had to be a shareholder as part of this whole food system. But most importantly, you need to be a shareholder in Corbin Hill Farm. But if you became a shareholder in Corbin Hill Farm, it now meant that you became an economic citizen. We don't think of low-income people on SNAP as economic citizens. We don't link those words together with them. But if you're an economic citizen, you have choices. Guess what? Low-income folks have very little choices. So we were now talking about a new narrative that not only talk about shareholders, economic citizens, but having choices. Choices to pay weekly for a share, choices to put your share on hold, join anytime, but we were also able to talk about terms that we gave slightly different meanings to it. So we have workers who are community organizers, but they're not simply nutrition people. They happen to know nutrition. We've seen too many nutritionists, that's what they send us because we're a problem, as opposed to sending us some good chefs who happen to know nutrition. Secondly, we have community organizers. And it's important to talk about community organizers. This is very different than talking about outreach workers. And so the significance of our vocabulary as we created this new structure was particularly important. And then we could introduce new concepts. What kills our community? We have all of these disparities in our community around health. So we created something called community health partners. Of course, these terms immediately brought the ire of a lot of folks. As a matter of fact, one person in Brooklyn, in the Brooklyn, what's those magazines called? I forget what that magazine's called. But they actually wrote a scathing article that, quite frankly, we were trying to destroy CSAs. Okay? So here we were. This was heresy. The vocabulary, they said this wouldn't work. It can't work at all. But what they were really saying is it wouldn't work for the farmer. But nobody within this context asked the question, but does it work for our community? And that to us was the fundamental question that needed to be asked. Our vocabulary was a vocabulary that tried to embrace not a passive kind of piece, but where we would be very proactive and one that was particularly empowering. But essentially, what we were really looking at was, we knew it, it's ownership and sovereignty. And if you don't want to talk about ownership and sovereignty, it's ironic. Everyone who comes into our community to talk about food, none of them had the power to give us any grasp whatsoever in that system. All they could do is provide a service that we would have to take today and tomorrow and the next day with a dependency model. So once we talked about ownership and sovereignty, we then had to speak about the issue of what are our values. And that to us is particularly important in terms of sovereignty. We believe that the community should be in leadership role. We believe in the community, self-reliance, and justice. We honestly believe that it has to be a grassroots movement. And it honestly believes that we have to speak in terms of genuine redistribution when it comes to what goes on in our community. But most important, we actually believe that public investment should lead to community empowerment. And that has to do over the policies, it has to do with the resources, and it has to do with what is grown and by whom and how. And eventually, the real pipe dream is that the community will own Corbin Hill Farm, and we can find rules and regulations that will get around the crazy rules of the SEC. So here we are in a position talking about transforming relationships. Transforming relationships between the farmers and our community. And so we did this from a demand perspective. We had to rethink how we were going to bring about this transformation with farmers, because, every single program begins with the farmer, and here's what the farmer can give you and provide you, et cetera. It required rethinking how to bridge the divide between the 32,000 people who live in Schoharie County with the 32,000 people per square mile who live in the South Bronx. And so that was the divide that we were interested in. And so the question we then asked ourselves was straightforward. How do we manage the risks of our shareholders while allowing and making possible the farmers to begin to access markets that they have zero access to? And we started it from a demand perspective. Everything says, here's what the farmer has to give to you. We changed the question. We asked the farmers, and I think I have a slide on this, because I'm big on slides. We asked the farmer, what can you grow for us? I've been to conference after conference, to meeting after meeting. Everyone looks at me in shock. No one has ever asked a farmer what they can grow for our community. So 5 years ago, we finally got enough collard greens. 4 years and 3 years ago, we got enough cilantro. This year, we got callaloo. How many people in this room know what callaloo is? Good. All right. So you begin to understand the change in the dynamic. There's another side to this. We also asked the farmer, and this is a longer conversation, but I'll at least pose the question that we asked the farmer, what do you think you can grow, what it is that you grow that we would love? By the way, folks, it's not kohlrabi. All right? But that's a longer conversation. I put up some numbers. This is where we are 5 years later. We started with 4 farmers. We now work with 32. Our first year, we sold 79,000. This year, we will be 400,000. We started with 200 shareholders 5 years ago. Last week, we had 1,170. The number 782 is one that I love, because you see, all the programs, the farmers markets, the health bucks, everything shuts down the second week of November. There's an assumption that basically says, guess what? These folks don't eat in the wintertime. So we started a winter share, and we had 782 people. The 4,252 has to do with the number of people who essentially we serve through our Community Health Partners program. 90% of these people make less than 200% of the poverty level. The 19 that you see there represents 19 of the 26 farmers who got grants to expand their facilities last year because of their connection with Corbin Hill from the Schoharie area. And the 700 represents a new program in which we are now going to be, we started 2 weeks ago with seniors. We have the friendliest senior bag that you have ever come across. It weighs a certain amount. It makes sure that there's nothing in there that's going to hurt your dentures, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And I will be concluding soon. People are listening. We started off with the community foundations. They're always the folks they give you 10,000, 15,000. They're the most important 10 and 15,000 because they give you the freedom to continue to develop, and you don't have to follow their agenda. all right? From there, we've gone, the Wallace Center has given us a grant. Actually, they called us a hub. We didn't even know we were a hub, okay? But we qualified under their definition, and somehow or the other, they gave us a small grant that made a difference to us. The larger foundations are coming to the picture, whether that be the Kellogg's, the Surdner's, and I should mention the New World Foundation, since they're right here in New York State, across the street from the Hudson. And I really want to go full circle and talk about Justin. Because I talked about Justin Brown at the beginning, I need to talk about Justin Brown as I conclude. Justin is still correct. I do not know much about farming. Notice I said much, okay? I knew nothing, now I don't know much. But what the relationship was, because we talk about transforming relationships even between investors and our community. 5 years ago, we had to put up collateral, we had to put personal guarantees. This year, the bank gave us a $100,000 grant. It's the beginning of the transformation that's taking place between investors and what it is we're doing and the record of what we're doing. Our funders now see this conversation as serving their needs and benefiting the farmers they serve. And at the same time, through Corbin Hill's founding vision, we are serving the vulnerable people who need these efforts the most. I want to leave you with this one photo of our annual gathering, and I could talk about this annual gathering forever, but I want to say thank you for listening.